Good evening, everyone, and Yeshkoach, Rabbi Bressler. Uh, um, my topic tonight is the fire of Sinai and the sound of Sinai. It's a title taken from something that my Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik Bracha mentioned. So he started out, he mentioned the pasuk in Devarim, Perek Daled, pasuk Tes. Pasuk says, "Rak yishamar lecha u'shmor nafshecha ma'od, pentishkachas hadvarim asher ro'einecha, ufen yashor milvavcha kol yemei chayecha, v'ratam levanacha livnei v'necha, yom asher amata lifnei Hashem lokecha b'chorev, v'amor Hashem elai ha'keli asa'am v'ashmim es dvaraya, shel yom edun liyira osi, kol yemim asher hem chayim al adama v'es b'nehem yilam eidun." You should be very careful and guard your souls very much, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, and lest you turn them out of your heart all the days of your life, and you have to tell them or inform of them to your sons and to the sons of your sons. The day that you stood in front of Hashem your God at Chorev, which is another name for Mount Sinai, when Hashem said to me, "Gather this nation, and I will let them hear my words, that they will teach to fear me all the days that they live on the land, and they will teach their sons." The Ramban, Nachmanides, on this pasuk discusses that we have a very important obligation to transmit the message and the words of Har Sinai to our children and our grandchildren and to the future generations. He also says a similar thing in the end of Parsha's Bo, and perhaps is what is the most famous Ramban in Chumash, that Hashem does not need to make a miracle in every generation to show that he runs the world. It was enough that he did so many supernatural miracles in Mitzrayim and with Yetzias Mitzrayim, and all we have to do is just transmit it. So part of this mitzvah, which the Ramban counts as one of the 613, is that we must transmit what was transmitted to us to the future generations. So in regard to the fire and sound of Sinai, if we look at Parshas Yisro, when it talks about the Aseret Adibros, the 10 Commandments, we see that there were many, there was thundering, there was very loud sounds at Har Sinai. There was also obviously the words that they heard, and there was a fire. The fire, similar to the fire that Moshe Rabbeinu saw at the burning bush, was a fire. I think Rabbeinu B'chaya explains it in the pasuk that we just quoted in Devarim, was a fire of warmth and light, of illumination, but not a fire of destruction. We have to transmit the positive aspects, not just the words that we heard, but certain attitudes, certain inspirations that from Har Sinai, and that is a mitzvah of Mesorah. So Mesorah means to give over, but besides for the mitzvah of Mesorah, there is a transmission which we have to transmit to each generation, that they should know what happened in previous generations. Obviously, the biggest example of this is the Seder on Pesach night, when we, on the Seder night, when we have to tell our children the story of Mitzrayim and of Yetzias Mitzrayim, but it's not limited to this. The context in which, and the reason why I decided to speak about this is because with the issues that came up with the coronavirus, there were many, let me take a step back, many things we do because we saw how our parents did it, how our grandparents did it. The first time when I was learning the laws of Basar B'chalav, and we spoke about, there's some halachos there talking about salting meat, I asked my Bobby, I said, "Bobby, how did you salt the meat?" So she said, "We had a blue pot, and the blue pot, we put in ice cold water, and we put in the meat into the pot, and we'd keep our eye on the clock for exactly 30 minutes. And then we would take it out, and then we had a board." And she described to me the whole process. So I could read from a book how it was, but it was so much better when I asked my Bobby, "How did you salt your meat?" And by the way, she was very disappointed when she moved to the north side of Chicago in 1969. By that time, all the butcher shops on the north side sold meat that was already kosher. It was already soaked and salted. She'd moved from South Shore. On the south side, you were able to buy meat. Some butchers had some meat that was already kosher, that they koshered, and some that wasn't. And she always liked doing it herself. She told me that too. But so I received in that conversation the Masorah from my Bubby how to soak and salt meat. So there are many things that we know how to do because that's what we saw growing up. But because of the Corona situation, there's certain issues that came up. We don't have a Masorah, so to speak, of how to act in these situations. We know what the books say, what the Sfarim say, but that's not the same as what we saw, as knowing what to do by what we see. And so I'm going to discuss two issues that we don't have that much of a Masorah on. We have some literature on, and those two issues are going to be Berchas Ilanos, making a bracha on a budding tree, and the second issue is what to do about Kriyas HaTorah when minyanim are able to start again. But coming from the focus of these are issues which we don't really have a Masorah. They're certain uncommon situations, the fact that people weren't going out to see budding trees, or the fact that I will discuss the shaila of when you weren't able to have Kriyas HaTorah at Shul 1 week, that you're supposed to make up the Kriyas HaTorah, and different opinions about that and different issues, especially with what happened with us, that we haven't had Shul for many, many weeks. It adds additional layers to this question, and discuss these issues. Now, I want to point out that when we have a new situation, let's say a new technological invention, and we say, are you allowed to use this on Shabbos? Are you not allowed to use this on Shabbos? Or let's just take a machine matzahs. Matzahs have to be made lishma, for the sake of the mitzvah. So when machines matzah were invented, there was a discussion about poskim, and some said, well, a machine is inanimate, it cannot have the kavana, so the intent to make the matzah for the sake of matzah. So you cannot use matzahs made from machine for Pesach night. And other poskim said, well, the machine is inanimate, but the person who is running the machine, he can have the intent, or she can have the intent that you're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah. So it's considered that was matzvah that was made for the sake of the mitzvah, and there's no problem with it. So that's a case of technical innovation. The Torah is applicable to these things. That's a case where we didn't have a Masorah because something didn't exist. The two issues that I'm going to speak about are things that the halacha does exist, but they're uncommon enough that we know some basics about it, but not all, but there's a lot of details which those questions don't come up. Another thing that I'll just mention, I'm not going to discuss the topic, but at the beginning, early on in the first few weeks of the stay-at-home orders, certain people were cutting and pasting from old Sidurim, that at least 150 years old, of what to do when you don't have a minyan for Kaddish. Those things are nice, but what I want to point out is that when we have a Masorah of how to do something, or we don't have a Masorah, we did not have a Masorah of doing these prayers, whatever they were, in the absence of a minyan. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm not saying it's wrong at all. But the thing is, I just want to point out is that there's a difference when there's the way that Rav Yashaber Salvechik, Rav Yosef Dov Salvechik Zecher Tzadik Livracha said in the Yortzeit, there's two types of Masorahs. There's a Masorah tradition that was given, that it's related to learning and reasoning. The Ritva in Eruvin on Daf 13 says that when Moshe Rabbeinu was given the Torah by Hashem, for each point, Hashem told Moshe, I believe it was 50 reasons that it was okay, that something was allowed, 50 reasons it's not allowed. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, that's very nice, that's what the Torah is, but what do we do? So Hashem said that the Beis Din, the Sanhedrin in each generation would decide what to do. So the Chachamim, the sages, would use the 13 methods of Rabbi Shmuel, or the 33, however many methods of hermeneutics of how to interpret the Torah, and then they would decide in each generation. For us, Shulchan Aruch is based on the psakim of the Talmud Bavli. The Rambam says very clearly that we don't now, since the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, was sealed, that is the law, the ruling for all of Klal Yisrael, and we can't change it. So that element of what that Ritva says doesn't apply. We can't change it anymore. But the point is that when you're given, they were deciding halacha based on how they interpreted the psukim according to known rules and known procedures. Sometimes in a different generation, they would see it in a different way than they saw it in an earlier generation. So even though you knew in a previous generation, they passed in a certain way, and again, this is in the time of the Mishnah or in the time of the Gemara, but before, but not after the time of the Gemara, they were able to know, we understand that that's how they learned it, but we see it this way. And later in a different generation, in those times could have passed differently. But there's a second type of Masorah, and that's a Masorah of, this is how it was. Some of the halach lamosh misinais, some of the oral halachos that we only know that it's not in the Chumash at all. The 5 essential elements of shchita, of slaughtering, or there's 10 oral traditions about tefillin. If you read Kriya Shema and you read Kadesh Li Kol B'chor, we talk about tefillin, but what shape are the tefillin? How are they made? What are they made of? Most of those, there's 10 halacha lamosh misinai oral traditions that it's not in the written Torah at all. So that type of Masorah, we say, this is the way we do it. It doesn't matter why, or you can make arguments against it. It doesn't matter. And in some of those, not all of those, Rav Yashaber explained how if some of those you try to argue on it, you're a kofar, you're denying Hashem because you're denying the primacy of the Torah, because if you reject that, you're completely rejecting the way that the Torah is. So the 2 main types of Masorah, and there's some details within each of those types, but there's a Masorah of limud, of learning, and then there's a Masorah of this is how it was done. So some people may not be very book knowledgeable, but they know exactly how to set the blach for Shabbos, how to do what haftorah you do when there's a certain situation. That is the Rav Yashaber called it the Masorah of Sha'al avicha v'yageidcha zekenecha v'yomer lach. Ask your father and he will tell you, your elders, and they will they will tell you. So the example that he gives is that the Masorah, the tradition of what animal the techelas, the blue strand, the blue dye for the tzitzis and the talis came from, we've lost that tradition. So about 150 years ago, approximately, the Rizhiner Rabbi felt that a certain type of snail was the proper animal from which the techelas came. And the Beis Halevi says you can have 1,000 proofs, but the whole koveya, the thing which establishes this as techelas, is the fact that we have a tradition. This is techelas. Once it was lost, nothing could bring it back until, according to the way some opinions learn, Eliyahu Navi, who never died, he knew what the halacha was, so he will tell us what it was, so he will reintroduce the tradition. So there's a Masorah of learning, there's a Masorah of this is the way we did it. So for these 2 topics I'm going to discuss, we're going to talk about halachas about them, and that certain issues that we don't usually have to deal with, we dealt with this way, and we have to do things a little bit more on the books and not on the way that we've practically done them, because these situations haven't really come up before. So in Birchas Eilanos, the Gemara in Brachos and Daf 43 says that in the springtime when you see trees blossoming, you say a special bracha. So the Shulchan Aruch brings down this halacha. It's in Reish Chavav, and the way that the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara mentions it, when you see trees in Nisan. So poskim already discussed how come it says you see a tree in Nisan, the month of Nisan. So they say because so many poskim say that was, it's talking about practically when do trees bud. So some poskim discuss, well, in Israel, we know that Tu B'Shvat is special. Obviously, it's the new year for trees, but Hashkedia Porachas, the almond trees blossom on Tu B'Shvat. So that is in Shvat, that's month and a half before Nisan. Could you make the bracha before Nisan? So that's a question based on the text of the Gemara. Does that apply? Several commentaries bring Kabbalistic reasons that it's supposed to be done only in Nisan. Some commentaries say that it cannot be done before Nisan, but if practically in your locale the trees don't bud in Nisan, you can make the bracha on the trees when they blossom in Iyar or even at the beginning of Sivan. The Aruch HaShulchan, who is known for describing the minhagim and the halachic rationale behind the minhagim in Lita in Eastern Europe in his place, he says our trees blossom in Iyar or early Sivan, so that's when we make the bracha. So for whatever reason, and maybe it has to do with the way that the climate in Eretz Yisrael could be different than in Chicago or in the northern part of North America or of the United States, is that in Eretz Yisrael they're very specific to make the bracha in the month of Nisan. So this year, because there was the quarantine and the stay-at-home orders, people didn't want to go out to find the fruit trees for whatever reason. So a very interesting thing was decided. They put a tree on, I didn't see it, it didn't come down my street, but I heard from my niece and nephew that, I saw that it happened, but I didn't see it, that they had I don't know if the tree was on the truck or it was being pulled on the trailer. So this tree was being brought out to make the bracha on the tree that was coming out on the street. So it's a very nice thing. People have an opportunity to make this bracha, you make the bracha. Now, one thing some people might forget is that some brachos, if the situation arises, you do that. There's no obligation to make sure that that situation comes up. For example, and this isn't about a bracha, but in general, if a person wears a four-cornered garment, you have an obligation to put tzitzis on that garment. But we're under no obligation to have a four-cornered garment to make sure we wear tzitzis. But Klal Yisrael has been very determined that it's a mitzvah. We want to be able to have this mitzvah. So we have a special garment called a talis katan, or erroneously in English we call it a pair of tzitzis, but the tzitzis really are the string. So every day we could always wear something that we're obligated in tzitzis. So we're under no obligation to wear the tzitzis every day. The obligation is only that if you have a four-cornered garment, you must put tzitzis on it. But we decide to put ourselves in a situation where we get to fulfill the mitzvah. Now, a bracha isn't necessarily a mitzvah. Vilna Gaon about the Seder night notwithstanding, and I'm not going to discuss that. But if you don't see a budding tree, you don't make a bracha. Is it a problem that you didn't make a bracha? No, it's not. But some people think that because there's an opportunity, and it's a good thing. I'm not criticizing that at all. There's an opportunity to make the bracha. They want to make sure they can say the bracha. Now, I'm going to come back to the discussion that we mentioned about the time. We mentioned could you make it before Nisan, after Nisan? But there's a separate question that usually doesn't come up in the context of this situation. Could you make a bracha on the tree if the tree was not growing in the ground, but it was growing in a planter? In halachic literature, that's called an atzitz, ayin tzadi yotzadi. So there's two types of planters. There's an atzitz nakuv, this planter that has a hole in the bottom, and an atzitz she'eino nakuv, and a planter that doesn't have a hole in the bottom. Now, halachically, there's very significant differences between these two planters. The planter with a hole is considered connected to the ground, and the one without a hole isn't. And there's different, because of that, there's different halachos related to Shabbos, related to Shemitah. If you were in Israel and it was the 7th year, are you allowed to water it or give it nutrients or there's different halachos. And if it's a planter with a hole or planter not a hole. But if you think about it, for this shaila, could you make a bracha on a tree that was not going in the ground? So some poskim say yes, some poskim don't. Many poskim don't discuss it. So Reb Chaim, it's quoted in the name, I've seen it many places in the name, quote in the name of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, that even if it's in a planter that does not have a hull, and therefore it's not considered that it gains any nutrients from the ground, it's okay to make a bracha on. Now that's a bit surprising. So Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon from Alon Shvut says that because the Rambam says that if a tree in its first 3 years, we're not allowed to eat from it. That's called orla. So if a tree is growing in a planter without a hull, it's considered, it's still considered that it's developing, and it has year 1, year 2, year 3. The year changes on Tu B'Shvat. So just like it's okay for orla, so it's okay for this. Now, is it really similar? Orla is this, each particular tree could have its own birthday. It's when you planted it. And is this bracha just on the tree? So Rav Chaim Kanievsky must hold that it's a bracha on a tree. Now, what would it be? If it's not a bracha on the tree, what would it be? So really, some poskim say that the way the Gemara says, when you see a tree budding, you go and make a bracha that thanking Hashem for creating beautiful things. The context of the bracha isn't just about a tree. It's thanking Hashem for everything He created, but we're also mentioning this specific tree. Now, because of the text of the Gemara and the way the Rambam brings it, which is very similar to the text of the Gemara, there's a sefer called Halachos Ketanos, which says he's very meticulous from the text of this halacha. It says when you go out and you see trees, so he says you have to go out. If it comes to you, you wouldn't make a bracha. If you see one budding tree, you wouldn't make the bracha because it's given in plural. Now, I'm not saying that he's right, but because many poskim say you could see one tree, but the reason that it says you see trees is because when there's one tree, there's usually more than one tree. Maybe you go to a forest or something. So the bracha isn't on a tree; it's on the bria, it's on the creation. So it's just that, just because you see a beautiful thing, now there's certain things you're allowed to make a bracha on, but not every beautiful thing you're able to make a bracha on. We might want to thank Hashem and praise Hashem and say Ma Rabbu Masach Hashem, but just because it's a good thing that it inspires you, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily make a bracha on it. I mean, if you would go to a science museum and you have a lightning one of those spheres that they're making lightning. Are you seeing lightning? Should you make osam isobracious? It's artificial lightning. It's not from the context of the bria when Chazal were thinking about the bracha. So putting that aside, Rav Chaim Kanievsky said that you're allowed to. For the reason that I just, and there's more than that, but for the one argument that I just gave is the reason why I would be careful making a bracha, because if you make a bracha when you're not supposed to, you're saying Hashem's name in vain. And in a different context, the Aruch HaShulchan says for some of these brachos that don't happen so often, if we're not so sure that it's the right situation, it's better not to make it, to not say Hashem's name in vain. Rav Shraya Davletsky, who was a Makubal, a Kabbalist, he passed away about 1.5 years ago in Eretz Yisrael. In his Haggadah, he says that if this tree was growing in a planter that did have a hole, you would be allowed to make the bracha for seeing a budding tree. But if it did not have a hole, he said you'd not be allowed to make a bracha. Now, I understand that halacha, his psak better, because if the planter has a hole in it, it's considered connected to the ground. So it could be connected to the bria. But still, if you think about it, perhaps anything different than just a regular tree growing in the ground, you shouldn't make the bracha. So I'm just saying some issues of people want to do a nice thing, but, is there reasons that you could make the bracha in that case? Yes. Is this a tough situation and it made people very happy? Yes, it made my niece and nephew were thrilled. They heard the music. It excited them about a mitzvah. It was a wonderful thing to help morale. But when we want to make brachos, it's just something that we should be careful about. And because normally these situations didn't come up, it's not something that we have a Masorah on. I don't think people in any other year people were pulling a tree on a truck to make the bracha on, but then it behooves us to look at the sources closer than we would have normally looked. Sometimes for things of, how to set the table for the Seder, or how to chop the vegetables on Shabbos, you know what you did from your parents, so you don't necessarily have to look it up, because that's the Masorah of, I saw this is how it was done. But because of this year, we weren't able to do things a regular way. Sometimes we might get ourselves into other shilas, and it might be better to be careful to not get ourselves into other shilas. So moving on here for our last few minutes, the second shilah, and this, God willing, will be very appropriate to us, where we have to decide in the next couple weeks of what we're doing, is at Kriyas HaTorah. So just want to introduce this fact by saying sometimes the Gemara says a halacha should be a certain way, but we don't want to do this because someone might mix up and think this is the regular way to do it, and they won't realize that there was an extenuating circumstance why it was done this way. For example, if there was a bris on a boy was 8 days old on Yom Kippur, the bris is done on Yom Kippur. Now, normally at a bris, we make a borei pri hagafen on a cup of wine as part of the bris ceremony. So what do we do on Yantif? So some Rishonim say, on Yom Kippur, when we're not allowed to drink, you should do it on wine anyway and give it to a kid. Now, some Rishonim don't like this because they say, well, the kid who you gave it to might think you're allowed to drink on Yom Kippur. So therefore, they say maybe make on besamim, like we make, instead of making the bracha on wine, you make the bracha on besamim, and then name the baby or whatever. But there's a real chashash. Sometimes a halach, we don't want to do something which normally we could, but it might cause people to make a mistake. And this is, I think, an application of the Masorah of She'al Avicha v'Yageidcha. We don't want to do something which it's permitted in this situation, but the people who see it may not realize that it's an exception. And we're going to see this about the Kriyas HaTorah. So there is an obligation or an ancient custom that we read the whole Torah every year. We start in Simchas Torah and end in Simchas Torah. And the Gemara says, "La'olam miyashlim parshiyos v'im tzibur." You should finish all the parshiyos with the community. So normally it's that we hear the Kriyas HaTorah every Shabbos, and wherever we heard on Shabbos, that's where we lane the next that following Shabbos after the Shabbos afternoon and Monday and Thursday, and then we read that whole parsha the next Shabbos, and we keep going. Now, what happened is that we haven't heard, many of us have not heard Kriyas HaTorah since Parshas Vayakov Pekudei, or maybe even Parshas Kisisa, when your location where the shelter in place went into effect. So the Shulchan Aruch brings down that if you didn't have the community didn't have Kriyas HaTorah, the following week you make a double parsha. You read the parsha you missed, and then the regular parsha, the regularly scheduled parsha. So then the question is, what if the previous parsha, and we have both of these shilas came up, what if it was a double parsha? The previous week was a double parsha, and this week is now one parsha. Can you read 3 parshios on one Shabbos? So some poskim say yes, and some poskim, including the Chida and others, say we could have 2 parshios on one Shabbos, but not 3 parshios on one Shabbos. So let's say for whatever reason, Truma Tetzaveh you missed, Kisis is a single parsha, but because the previous parsha was a double parsha, you don't read 3 parshas. And then a second shaila would be, let's say the parsha you missed was Vayechi, it was a chazak. Now in the Torah, there's 4 blank lines between the end of one sefer and the beginning of the next sefer. So because there's such a gap, are you allowed to read beyond those blank spaces to have a Kriyas HaTorah? So some poskim say no. If it's 2 parshios that are regular parshios, you could read them straight, that's okay. But not if there's the gap in the Torah because it's between Sefer Bereshis and Shemos, or Shemos and Vayikra, etc., etc. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan is very clear. He says you're supposed to make up the laning, so it doesn't matter if it was a double parsha, or last week was a single parsha and this week's a double parsha, or it's more than one parsha. The Vilna Gaon was once in jail, and he missed 4 parshios. When he was freed, he had them make up all the parshios, which is an even bigger chiddush because the community did have Kriyas HaTorah. He only personally missed it. So in this year, we have all these questions. We had parshios from Sefer Shemos and the whole Sefer Vayikra, and Bamidbar, which was today, and maybe Naso, depending on when we're allowed to reopen. Should we make up all these parshios? Now, normally, there's a halacha of Shnai Mikra v'Yachas Targum. You're supposed to read the Parsha twice, and the Targum, the best to read the Aramaic. There is a opinion cited in Hagos Maimoni and on the bottom of the Rambam that if you're not able to hear Kriyas Torah, you should do Shnai Mikra V'Yachas Targum, and that way you're going to keep your weeks up, and by Simchas Torah you'll be okay because you'll have gone through the whole Torah. So from what I've heard, some people are going to rely on this. We missed more than one or whatever, so you were just going to start reading from where we started, where we stopped. I know I instructed people at our shul to follow this opinion and to read the Parsha with the Onkelos, and I recommended they could read it with English because the Onkelos may not be so meaningful for them, which Post can discuss. So one place where, so it's not so common that you miss Kriyas Torah, that the whole community misses Kriyas Torah. Someone I was communicating with mentioned that when there was a hurricane a few years ago, so they didn't have Shabbos in Florida, a minyan, so the following week, they read the double Parsha. They read the previous week's Parsha and then the current week's Parsha. And even that, there's a discussion. It seems that it's based on Rav Ovadia Yosef, said that you would read the whole previous Parsha and the first Aliyah of this week's Parsha as one really super long Aliyah. Whereas according to other poskim, if it was just two Parshas you'd make up, you should read three Aliyahs from the first Parsha, and then the fourth Aliyah would combine the first Parsha and go into the last Parsha, and then you'd have three more Aliyahs. So for this year, obviously, if you would want to make it up, so according to the Aruch HaShulchan, there's no problem about it. It would be a really super long Kriyas Torah, and each Aliyah, some people say you could have more than 7 Aliyahs, but the question is how many people you're having in shul to have that many Aliyahs, but you have an Aliyah that would have more than one Parsha. So again, it's something that's very rare, but it's a shaila that we have to know about for this year. And will your shul make up only one Parsha? Because some say also that this works just like Tashlumin. If you missed, let's say, Shachris, you could say two Shmona Esrei and Mincha for making up the one you missed. But with Tashlumin only applies for the most recent. You can't make up more than one missing. So are you going to hear a double Parsha? Are you going to hear a very long Kriyas Torah? Or are we just going to read where whatever that Parsha Shavua is and rely on the other opinions to complete the whole Torah cycle by Kriyas Torah, by that will be completed by Simchas Torah. So I'll just end that Sefer, I don't know, a Sefer Pedeas Avraham brought down an opinion that when you would have a situation like this, one opinion to make that the community missed a reading and you have a double Parsha, he says there's no chashash, we're not concerned that someone's going to see that we're read it in an irregular way and think that that's regular. So again, it might be important that when we were doing things slightly differently than this year because of the Corona situations, we tell people normally we don't do it this year, but because of the Corona, that's why we're doing it this year. So that would keep our Mesorah of Sha'al Avicha V'Yageitcha intact. No one will, God forbid, make a mistake and think that's the way we normally do it. For example, the CRC relying on Rav Shlomo Zalman is having and I'm plugging, I think on Monday they're having another phone call for people who weren't able to they needed something new, a pot, a pan, and they could go to the mikvah. So it's not something we normally rely on, but because we have no choice right now, they declared ownerless in front of 3 people, so there's no need for, so temporarily we don't have to put in the mikvah. The CRC is being very good and very clear about it, that this is temporary use for this exceptional circumstance, and it's not something you can normally rely on. So that's the proper way to do things for this year. So God willing, may we be zocha before the Shavuos, so we'll be able to receive the true Mesorahs dating back all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, and I want to thank the CRC for offering this beautiful opportunity of communal Torah learning, and may it be a great zchus for the cholim who are sick from the corona, and may it inspire our whole community to reach greater levels in keeping mitzvos and in learning Torah.
Thank you, Rabbi Lazovsky. Thank you to all the speakers tonight, and thank you all of those who joined. Just one last reminder for this evening: if anybody still hasn't done so, to please go to crcweb.org/Shavuos to sign up to learn Mishnayos or parts of Tanakh as part of the community-wide Siyum over Shavuos. Again, you can go to crcweb.org/Shavuos please sign up. Thank you, everyone. A very good Vach, a good Chodesh, and we look forward to you joining us tomorrow evening for another 4 speakers. Thank you so much.